Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Chicken sandwich, cheese sandwich, sandwiches, caviar, coffee, champagne. Would you like anything? Adriana, with a charming smile, walked around the first-class cabin of the huge airplane, where she worked as a flight attendant. Adriana was an experienced employee and could tell at a glance if her passengers needed anything. She didn't even have to look at her watch to sense when it was time for her to go to the guests of the flight. Sweetheart of champagne, if you would be so kind. An elderly man in a business suit, who had obviously flown from St. Petersburg to London on business, called out to her. He was sitting at the window reading the latest issue of the English press. As Adriana walked down the row, pushing a cart filled with appetizers and second courses ahead of her. Of course, for 1 minute, the girl said with the same smile, and then very deftly took out a bottle of champagne from the bottom compartment of the cart and carried it to the service room, opened it quickly and almost without a throw, then poured the bubbly golden drink into a crystal glass and brought it to the businessman. "Thank you, Adriana. You are just lovely." The man thanked her and plunged back into his reading. Adriana truly loved her job. She served on board the airliner for the 4th year, and in all this time she had never regretted her choice. The endless skies, the beautiful uniforms, the opportunity to see other countries and the variety of time zones. All this allowed her to feel both free and distract her soul from all sorts of everyday problems, anxiety, worries, which Adriana, alas, had plenty. Finishing her divorce, Adriana returned to her workplace, setting the cart down, glanced at herself in the mirror to correct a few strands, knocking everything out of her hair. Adriana was very attractive, a long-legged beauty of 28 with shiny brown hair and dark green eyes like lush summer grass. Her smile made men tremble with delight and women silently sigh with envy. However, there was something in her appearance that was the cause of deep complexes of the young stewardess. Adriana looked at her left hand with a sigh, where her middle finger was about 2 phalanges shorter than the rest. The girl had painted her nails herself on purpose, with the calmest neutral-colored nail polish, and had never had a manicure in a salon, embarrassed by this, as it seemed to her, very noticeable physical flaw. For the same reason, Adriana almost never wore rings, not wanting to draw attention to her long but professional pianist fingers. Against their background, this short man, as the girl herself called him, stood out terribly by his absurdity. The only exception was a modest gold wedding ring, which the stewardess wore on the ring finger of her left hand. It was the last thing she had left as a memento of her late husband Charles. Looking at the ring, Adriana was once again involuntarily immersed in her own memories. Charles had died a little over a year ago in a wicked irony. The week before his death, his husband had taken out a loan at an unbelievably high interest rate, and now Adriana had to pay it off alone. For a young flight attendant, this amount of almost $20 million was simply unaffordable, and every time she thought about it, Adriana immediately became hysterical and wild terror, all because this loan was taken not in the bank, with which you could still try to negotiate, but very dangerous people, representatives of the criminal layer of the city. Even now, after a year and a little, Adriana could not fully give these terrible people all the money. Her father constantly called the girl, demanding from her the unfortunate debt. Adriana still did not understand what could push Charles to turn to these thugs for money. And most importantly, why he needed such an astronomical amount of money. In the last month, the thugs had been on the loose. They started writing on the wall next to the stewardess's house horrible threats, or sent her on her way home from the airport, following her cab in their big black SUVs with tinted windows. Clearly, their main purpose was to intimidate the young widow, to such an extent that she could think of nothing else but to give them their damned money. And it must be said, to exert that kind of influence. They were brilliant at it. "What's up, Pa? How long does my boss have to wait for his money?" Adriana asked. A tall, broad-shouldered, and completely bald ambo had once trapped the unfortunate stewardess in an alley not far from her house. Adriana was on her way back from another flight and had no idea what a terrible surprise awaited her. I gave you another 50,000 last week. I just don't have any more. Adriana tried to extricate herself from his stony grip. I've explained to you 100 times. I don't have the capacity to raise that much money in such a short period of time. The bastard just grinned wryly. Are you confused? Pa, the chief's been too soft on you. He allowed you to pay back your debt in installments, and for a whole year. But the clock is ticking, and we're not even close to half that amount yet. You get as much interest each time as I can give you now. Looking at the thugs with a pleading look in her eyes, said Adriana. Even if I sell my apartment, it will still not be enough. And you understand that very well. Then the bouncer extended his huge index finger and slowly stroked Adriana's cheek. On her cheek. The sensation made the girl immediately nauseous, especially since the scoundrel's fingers were unbearably smitten with thick tobacco. That's the beauty. Low voice, said the collector. The chief asked you to tell him that if by the next time we meet you don't have all the missing sum on your hands, he will help you to give it to others. In a much nicer and easier way. The man smiled lecherously, and Adriana's heart immediately sank. No, you're off the mark, she said, looking at the ambo with unspeakable horror in her eyes. I'll report you to the police and you'll all go to jail. Instead of answering, the scoundrel laughed loudly, and the next second he struck Adriana briefly in the stomach, with his in the stomach, with such force that the girl felt as if she'd been blown out of her mind. She bent in half. She began to gulp in the cool fall air with her open mouth. But oxygen stubbornly did not want to penetrate into her lungs, which spoke with pain. Don't move. Bitch, you growled bandit. If even a word to a cop will give you such a traffic circle adventure. Understood me, Amble grabbed Adriana by the chin and forced to look his little swim, anger and hatred for all the female sex. Eyes. Got it. Once more he shouted at the object in a weak voice, but in his hands the flight attendant spoke out in pain and fear. Tell me, how much time do I have? Now that's another conversation. Almost good-naturedly pronounced the bandit. Then he put the girl on her feet so easily, as if she weighed nothing at all. You should have started solving problems so constructively right away. None of this would be happening to you now. Adriana gave him a sidelong glance full of physical contempt, and gently pushed against the wall of the house. As for the collector, he took a small diary out of his pocket and marked a date with a pencil. Adriana stood holding her stomach and stared at the scoundrel in mute anticipation. You have 2 weeks, he finally said. Then with a thud, he slammed the day planner shut. You won't take the rest of the money. In that time, you can get ready to meet my boss. And I assure you, you better be nice to him. Otherwise, we'll sell you into slavery to the Turks. They love people like you there, Natasha. They love them very much. The amble smiled at Adriana. In farewell, the predatory jackal smiled like a jackal's grin, and then, without hurrying, got into his black SUV and disappeared into the night. As soon as his vehicle pulled away, Adriana felt such despair that she was ready to tear her hair out, sobbing and sobbing at the hopelessness of her own situation. The girl struggled to get up to her apartment on the way, holding on to the railing so as not to fall. Adriana didn't know where she could get the rest of the sum, but she objectively realized that even if she asked her superiors for a loan, it was unlikely that the airport would be able to meet her needs. Still, it wasn't even hundreds of 1 million, but 1 million. Sit down. How could you leave me like that? Ta cried, looking at the photo of her husband in a funereal frame. Adriana. Where am I going to get the money now? God, it's even frightening to imagine what they can't do to me. Charles Poliakov was a businessman. Not so much that he stole 1,000,000, but he still had some decent income. In this case, the man tried to conduct several types of entrepreneurial activities, ranging from trading products at the city market and ending with a network of production for the manufacture of doors. Of course, all this required money, and a lot of money. And this is where Charles' business acumen gave, as they call it, wacky. The young businessman was ready to spend all day long at his enterprises, trying to control every step, which was very much disliked by the managers and leading managers. And so it turned out that Charles, every time without realizing it, lost on trust. He invested a lot of money and time in his companies, but he was wrong about people every time. Cunning managers managed to steal from the businessman's company one way or another. Then the case suffered imminent losses, had to start all over again. When most of the money ran out, and to correct his business mistakes, Charles had nothing to fall back on. He risked taking a huge loan from a street Petersburg authority. Banks did not believe Adriana's husband anymore. Unlike the criminal head, who willingly agreed to lend Charles money, the naive businessman believed that he could pour enough money into each of his companies to make them revive and start making a profit. Charles planned to pay off the debt to the authority. But fate had it the other way around. The most surprising thing was that despite her husband's failures in business, Adriana still loved him with all her heart. Charles was intelligent, gentle, kind, in a word, the most perfect man in the world. And Adriana grieved for him terribly. Even now, after all this time, she couldn't fully believe that he was no longer around, and that his car would never again stop outside the house, where they had a spacious and beautiful apartment. Most of all, Adriana was the fact that they had never had children in their 2 years of marriage, whether she had a son or a daughter with Charles. Then maybe she would have borne it all a lot easier? No, the stewardess shook her head. Given the history of this debt, who knows what kind of danger the child might be in? It's probably even better that I didn't have time to give birth. Remembering the terrible death of her spouse, Adriana shook her head sadly each time. God forbid that anyone, not even their enemies, should have such a horrible ending to their lives. Charles then went to their country guest house for the weekend. He told his wife that he wanted to be alone for a while to think about his life and how best to dispose of the money he had received from the creditors. Adriana offered her husband to go with him. Charles politely declined. "Don't worry, Adriana. What would you do there? You just got back from a trip. You need a rest, and I'll spare myself from kebabs. I'll brew a stronger cup of tea and think how to save my business." An anxious shadow flashed across my wife's face. She felt in her gut that it would be better for him not to go anywhere alone. "Charles, I'm afraid, honestly," Adriana admitted to him. "These people, this Sebastian, he's the real culprit. Maybe he's following you. You don't know." Charles only laughed softly. "Adriana, my good daughter, you've read too many books. Sebastian is an ordinary businessman like me, or any other man who runs several large companies at once. Yes, he's had some ties to the underworld in the past, but that was all a long time ago. Now his reputation is practically crystal clear." Adriana looked at her husband doubtfully. "That's the key word here, practically. Who knows if he can be trusted? You speak of him as if he were a kindly man. Well, he's far from it. How many raids did he do last year?" Charles turned away from his wife irritably. "Don't start, please. If you believe everything they say in the news, you'll make a lot of money for yourself. Besides, Sebastian's only a witness in those cases. All right, Adriana, let's not discuss my partner's business past." "Okay," Adriana then pressed her lips together resentfully, but quietly said, "As you know, Charles. But only I want my husband to live with me many more happy years, and you are literally dragged into some bad story." The couple had a fight that night over this unfortunate loan, because Adriana wouldn't let him go out of town alone. However, Charles has always been a man, stubborn by nature, so he did not listen to his wife and packed his sports bag. The next morning, he went to their cottage. Adriana was terribly nervous all day, and as it turned out, for good reason. Toward evening, Charles finally stopped contacting her. She felt that something terrible had happened, but until the last, she kept waiting and believing that it was all just her own speculations. Only when the next morning her husband did not return home, Adriana realized that her intuition had not failed her. Charles's phone was off, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Please, God, please, if only he were alive. As soon as the young woman thought about it, her phone interrupted from an incoming call. The number was an unfamiliar one, so Adriana's heart immediately sank to the bottom. "Allah," in a voice trembling with excitement, she said. "Adriana," an unfamiliar male voice asked her from the other end of the line. "It's the captain. I have some sad news for you. Your husband Charles died last night in a fire that broke out in your country house. But his legs gave out, and if it hadn't been for the chairs next to her, she would surely have fallen to the floor. Adriana brought her hand to her lips, trying to suppress a moan. God was all she could manage, she whispered. How? The experts determined that it was an accident, the policeman explained. Apparently, your husband had overlooked a container of lighter fluid, and it had exploded. That can't be. The girl protested. My husband has always been a very careful man. He would never leave the liquid near a fire. The captain gave a slightly irritated shout before replying. Adriana, I'm only saying what has been confirmed. Facts are such a thing, you can't argue with them. Your husband was grilling kebabs on a brazier, and the brazier was in the garage under the roof. Apparently, the spark from the coals hit the jar of liquid first, and then the fire spread throughout the room. So our house burned down too, the young woman clarified, amazed. The policeman sighed noisily and answered in the affirmative. Your cottage is surrounded by forest on 3 sides. Because of this created the most, favorable conditions for the fire. The fire spread from the garage to the interior of the house and everything burned to the ground. I'm sorry, I realize that it's hard for you to accept the fact of your husband's death and the total destruction of your country house. But what happened was purely a series of unfortunate circumstances, and that's all. It's nobody's fault, and you mustn't blame yourself either. I wanted to go with him, I sobbed into the phone. Adriana wanted to be there for me. Calm down, please. The captain said softly. If you had been there with your husband, you would have died the same way. There would have been no chance of you two surviving. I know it's a small consolation now, but at least you were alive. After that conversation, Adriana couldn't sleep a wink and spent the whole night staring at the ceiling. She didn't want to believe that Charles was gone. This death seemed so terrible and ridiculous, and the very strange carelessness the policeman had spoken of was completely out of character for her spouse. And eventually Adriana began to suspect that Charles was killed just because of the very money borrowed on credit from the authority. Her husband's funeral was very modest. There was nothing left of Charles, and an empty coffin had to be lowered into the ground. Adriana couldn't sleep for almost a month. Over and over again, her thoughts returned to her husband's death. The only thing that helped take her mind off it a little bit was work, and Adriana continued to go out on one flight after another, almost without noticing how rapidly the dates on the calendar were changing. And then the threatening phone calls started, and the woman learned that she would now have to pay off the loan for her late husband. At first, Adriana thought she would give them the bag with the money Charles had brought from them on the day the loan was arranged. However, after going through the entire apartment and checking all the accounts, Adriana came to the horrible conclusion that the money was nowhere to be found. Then she remembered that her husband had gone to the country with the bag. So the woman thought to herself, Charles wanted to hide the money at the cottage, only they were probably burned in that monstrous fire. Adriana felt her leader's soul grow frightened. She could not imagine how she would be able to pay such a huge sum to the bandits. Taking a risk in her own life, she asked to meet Sebastian when she was brought to his mansion. Adriana thought she'd never get out of there alive again. But the authority, seeing the beautiful wife of his deceased borrower, immediately softened his anger into mercy and gave Adriana a 1-year reprieve on her debt. And now the term was coming to an end, and the poor woman was still unable to pay half of her debt. So she began to work almost without a day off, hoping to earn as much money as she could before David's servants got to her again. Adriana grew up in a village in one of the remote Siberian settlements. Her parents were people simple, but honest and loving each other. The girl's father, Kevin, served as a forester at the district center. Despite his advanced age, the man was still full of strength and could withstand multi-kilometer hikes through the forest. Molly's mother worked at the village post office. She delivered letters and newspapers to all the inhabitants of their old, and every year stopped more and more crowded village. Both spouses loved their work and considered it very important, and so there were almost never any serious arguments between them about whose role in the family was more important. For as long as Adriana could remember, There had always been love and understanding in their home, and her parents brought her up solely by their own examples, trying to be role models for their daughter. The girl never heard a rude or angry word in her address, but always found support and good advice if she needed it. After school, Adriana realized that in their glorious village for her, alas, there were no prospects. She wanted to study foreign languages, but where could she apply them in such a remote place? Besides, Adriana had another dream to tell, about which the yesterday's graduate was at first afraid even to her parents. Adriana had been beckoned by the sky since childhood. Being a very little girl, she could spend hours admiring the footprints of airplanes coming in the sky, dreaming and wondering what was inside. Inside so small if you looked at them from below, and so huge it was worth it to see them up close in air cars. The girl's parents had never flown on airliners. Adriana had never even been to the sea. That is why her passion for traveling, coupled with the opportunity to rise high above the ground, gave birth to her passionate dream of becoming a flight attendant. Nevertheless, her father and mother, realizing that their daughter needed a higher education with peace of mind, let her go to the city. Adriana thought for a moment. Learning languages was a priority for her right now anyway. Then, once she was settled in the capital, she could think about a career as an air hostess. And so it happened. After graduating with honors, Adriana became a certified translator of 2 languages at once, English and Spanish. This opened the door to the world of brilliant high-paid work. So for a while, the girl really worked as a secretary with the functions of a translator, working in a very prestigious company in the media business. Adriana was able to rent a beautiful apartment in the city center and felt absolutely great. Only she still sometimes dreamed about the sky and her new stewardess uniform at night. After working at that company for about 2 years, she realized that she couldn't continue to ignore her dream. It was then that Adriana finally decided to try to enroll in a flight attendant course. The girl studied diligently and crammed the necessary material around the clock, ignoring parties and outings with friends. But the result of her efforts was exactly as she wanted. Adriana passed the final exam with a perfect score and was able to get her dream job. Fortunately, her health had always been excellent, and her incredibly attractive looks allowed her to easily pass the unspoken face check that was an integral part of getting the job. Going on her first flight, Adriana felt an incomparable excitement. The feelings overwhelmed her, and, unable to withstand their pressure, she even quietly cried, while no one saw her most long-cherished dream come true. And for the first time since graduation, Adriana felt in her place. On one of the flights, she met Charles. The young man was older than her by only 3 years and was flying to another city to make a business deal. Both felt that they liked each other. However, propriety forced them to wait until the end of the flight. Only then did Charles dare to approach the young, beautiful flight attendant and invite her to dinner at a restaurant. "Please do not refuse," with a mute plea in her eyes, looked at her Charles. "I know this will seem strange to you, but as soon as I saw you, I realized that this is a girl I must try to get to know." Charles' embarrassed smile that accompanied these words made Adriana herself first blush and then laugh lightly. "If you think our meeting is a sign, then I certainly have no right to refuse you." The first meeting was soon followed by a second. And now a stormy and tender romance had broken out between the young people. Adriana felt the most incredible emotions. After all, she could not even imagine that she would be lucky enough to meet a man whose soul seemed to be the other half of her own. Charles understood the girl so well that sometimes it seemed to Adriana that everything that was happening to her was a fairy tale dream. Now I am standing in front of the mirror in the steward's office. Adriana thought that life with Charles had been the happiest period of her life. It was unlikely that she would ever meet another man with such soulful qualities. Her husband was more than just a partner with whom she had agreed to spend the next years of her life. He was her friend, and the most passionate lover and like-minded person, always ready to support in a difficult moment. The more terrible was their last parting, when one stupid quarrel forced the loving spouses to spend that night before his trip to the dacha. Apart, Adriana wanted to sit down on her seat in the aisle, as suddenly the airplane began to shake mercilessly. The lights in the cabin flickered and immediately heard the loud voices of passengers, full of discontent and fear. "Jesus, we're going down," a woman screamed. "What's going on?" "Stewardess, where's the stewardess?" I heard an elderly man's voice. "Mommy, I'm scared. Are we going to die?" A child's voice shrieked somewhere very close to Adriana. Adriana realized at once that they were in a turbulent zone. This had happened to her many times before. And still, every one of them, the young flight attendant, was a little bit scared. However, she had no right to show her feelings in front of the passengers, as it would be an absolute violation of all personnel behavior rules on board. Taking a few deep breaths, the woman moved into the cabin and tried to maintain an expression of complete equanimity on her face. Not only that, Adriana smiled dazzlingly at everyone she passed by with requests to buckle up and stay calm. "Why are we shaking so much?" The businessman who had recently ordered champagne from her was indignant. "Are you sure you are telling us the truth, or are you just trying to bide your time until we find out that we have 100 meters left to fly to the ground, and we can start saying goodbye to life in advance?" "Don't worry, it happens sometimes." During the flight, Adriana tried to reassure me. "The turbulent zone will soon end, and we will continue our journey in peace. There's absolutely no reason to worry." The businessman muttered something unhappily in response, but still securely fixed the wall from his seatbelt. Walking a little further, Adriana turned her attention to a beautiful fellowship lady in her mid-50s. The woman was dressed in an expensive Koralov-colored suit and held a luxurious leather purse of a delicate cream shade on her lap. Adriana immediately realized this was a woman of great wealth, her manicure styling as well as her beautiful shoes from the latest collection of the famous fashion house spoke for themselves. But no matter how much money she had, this woman was first and foremost an ordinary person. And like all the passengers on this flight, and was now experiencing genuine fear. At the moment when the stewardess was equal to her seat, the plane shook violently again. The lady shrieked loudly and dropped her purse to the floor. Adriana instinctively bent over, easily picking up the elegant accessory, then handed it to the passenger, keeping a polite smile on her face. "Thank you, pale lips," uttered the lady. And then her gaze fell on the left hand of the stewardess, with which she was holding her bag. The woman instantly commanded that first snow and looked at Adriana with a mute question. She immediately recognized that finger, the only one shorter than all the others. Adriana, in an almost colorless voice, whispered to the stunned passenger Betty. And that was exactly the name of that rich woman. Suddenly she felt as if her whole body was pierced by an electric current. For a few seconds, everything in front of her eyes was as if inked, and the lady was afraid that she would faint. "Yes, I understand that you are scared, but everything will be over very soon." Honestly, the young woman promised her. There's only a little bit of patience left. After that, smiling at Betty, the stewardess walked further into the interior of the cabin with a calm gait. As soon as she was out of sight, the ladies somehow grabbed at their hearts. "Oh my God, it can't be. Alive and on the same plane as me," Betty thought. Could it really be her? Though who else could it be so peculiar? Betty crossed herself and got up from her seat and made her way to the corridor where the stewardesses were sitting. Adriana was discussing something with her partner when she caught the amazed look in the rich passenger's eyes. "Are you feeling better?" Adriana asked politely, looking at the woman with genuine concern. "Yes, thank you," slowly said the woman, and from excitement, literally spun with her nails in her small purse. "I'm sorry, maybe it's not the right thing to do, but I really need to talk to you. I wonder if you could spare a few minutes." Adriana gave an embarrassed glance to the second stewardess and nodded. "All right, have a seat, please." Adriana's partner immediately got up from her seat and went to the cabin to see if the other passengers needed anything. Betty sat down on the very edge of the seat and continued to fiddle with her purse in silence for a few seconds. The woman just didn't know where to begin. What she was about to tell this young woman might seem like complete nonsense to others, but still, she couldn't afford to miss this chance. Who knows, maybe she wasn't wrong. You see, Betty began, very embarrassed. I happen to have noticed a certain peculiarity on your hand, your finger." It was Adriana's turn to blush with embarrassment. The young woman instinctively clenched her left hand into a fist so that the shortened phalanx was not visible. "Yes, I realize it must have been unpleasant for you to see such a thing, but it's been with me since birth, and there's nothing I can do about it." Yeah, we shook our heads with emotion. No. It's not about that at all. I never meant to offend or humiliate you in any way. Not at all. Adriana looked at her somewhat confused. But then what was it that excited you so much? Betty took a deep breath, then decided to tell her. "You see, many years ago I lost my daughter. She was only 3 years old at the time. My husband, the girl's stepfather, was traveling with her to another city, and they had an accident. My husband couldn't handle the steering, and the car went into a ditch. When he woke up, his daughter was nowhere to be found. He, being wounded, went around the neighborhood, but he never found her. Like in the water. Even now, almost 30 years later, the memory of the lost child caused Betty almost physical pain. A deep maternal wound in her heart has not healed. And every word spoken aloud to her daughter was to the woman like the cutting edge of a knife." The lady wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, but in Adriana's face she read only empathy and bewilderment. "I sympathize with you very much," Adriana said sincerely. "But don't be rude. I don't see how I can help you." A faint smile flashed across Betty's face. "Is your name Adriana?" "Adriana, that's right," nodded the flight attendant. "Adriana, maiden name A. What does that have to do with your story?" Suddenly the rich lady reached out her hand and stroked her shoulder affectionately. "My daughter's name was Adriana too, and she had exactly the same peculiarity as you. It runs in our family from my grandfather Robert. He was the first in his family to have one of his fingers shorter than the others." And then Betty looked at Adriana crying and smiling through her tears at the same time. When the stewardess realized what she meant, the world around the young woman seemed to sway, and turbulence had nothing to do with it. You mean you think I might be your lost daughter from 20-odd years ago?" The rich lady nodded her head slowly and said, "I don't just think that. I am absolutely sure of it. Adriana, everything fits. Your boy, your name, and your age. Adriana, how happy I am that I found you, that you're alive." Betty couldn't help herself and wanted to hug Adriana. However, the flight attendant gently stopped her from doing so. To say that Adriana was broken by what she heard was to say nothing. It was too much even for her, a mere stewardess who didn't know how to pay off a loan to the bandits instead of her late husband. What a daughter of millionaires, by God, I'm not sorry. But you don't think it could be just a coincidence? The young woman looked at her doubtfully. The tragic disappearance of your girl is certainly a real grief, and I can understand why you've taken a fancy to my peculiarity. But I already have parents, and they are alive, thank God, and they love me, and I love them too. The millionaire looked at her sadly, but still stood her ground sweetly. "I don't know how this could have happened. Perhaps you should ask your mom and dad about that. However, I still believe that you are my Adriana, my lost little daughter. If you would agree to meet me a little later and do the DNA test." Adriana sat unable to utter a word. She didn't know how to react to everything she heard. In the end, it took her a few sips of Fedu water to get over her feelings. In the end, she agreed to meet Betty again and took her business card with her home address. This was after the plane had landed. So as soon as Adriana stepped out of the airport, she immediately ordered a cab and went to the nearest bus station where she bought bus tickets to her home village. If this woman was telling the truth, then did it mean that her mom and dad had kept the secret of her past from her for so many years? But why did they need to? Had lies haunted Adriana since childhood? All these questions made the woman's head spin, but she was determined to find out the truth, so she waited impatiently for the bus to take her back to her hometown. Kevin and Molly were pleasantly surprised to see their favorite daughter Adriana on the doorstep. My soul counted around the stewardess' happy mother. "Would you have at least told us ahead of time that you were coming? I would have made your favorite raspberry pie. You sure did," Father said with a slight reproachful tone. "You don't take care of yourself with all that flying. Do they feed you at all?" Kevin took the suitcase from his daughter and carried it into their beautiful house. which the forester had built himself many years ago using old-fashioned technology without a single nail, of which he was very proud. When the whole family sat down in the kitchen to drink tea, and Adriana told them the latest news from her life, of course, hiding from them the part that concerned the loan. There was a long pause between the relatives. It was as if the parents felt that Adriana had come to them for a reason. The couple glanced at each other eloquently, but gave their daughter the right to be the first to start the conversation. "Mom," Dad began slowly, "Adriana, I want to tell you that I love you very much." The young woman hesitantly moved the cup from the saucer to the table and back again. She was very nervous, and for the first time, she didn't know how to ask her parents about the thing that worried her most at the moment. "We love you too, daughter, and we always will, no matter what happens. But that's not why you came here." Her father looked at her with the right expression. "You see the whole point, as always." "Daddy," said Adriana thoughtfully, and then asked bluntly, "Are you my real parents?" Adriana looked intently at her family, shifting her gaze from one to the other. There was nowhere to retreat further. A slight shadow ran across Molly's face, and her smile began to slowly fade. "Why even ask such questions?" "Adriana," the woman asked excitedly. "Of course, E and I are your parents. Who else would we be?" At that moment, the father covered his mother's hand with his own, and then said in a low voice, "Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't find out. It can't be so that the truth won't come out sooner or later." The man shook his head doomedly and dismissed his mother's objections with a glance. Then he poured himself a new cup of tea from the samovar and took a big sip. It was a long time ago, staring off into the distance at the closet. "Molly and I had been through a lot of grief back then." Kevin was silent for a moment, but Molly continued for him. "I had my third miscarriage. I couldn't bear the baby. And the doctors said that if I tried again, I wouldn't survive. I could die of bruising and complications." Adriana's mother exclaimed and wiped her eyes with the edge of her handkerchief. She did not want to remember that difficult period of her life. "I was always walking through the woods, trying to ease my grief in this way," Kevin went on to say. "And one day, as I was passing by a walnut grove, I saw you sitting on the edge of the forest, weeping tears." Adriana's father grinned slightly at the memory. "Do you think why your mother and I called you Squirrel? That's why you got such a family nickname. Because you were sitting there under walnut with your fluffy red pigtails and wiped your face with your hands. Definitely sad." It was obvious that Kevin felt very strong emotions while telling about it. And though not a single muscle on his face trembled, his father's shoulders on the way to the ice silently, with all their strength under the pressure of their sobs. "You were only 3 years old then," Mother explained. "Father scooped you up in an armful, just like that, and brought you home." Molly smiled sadly with tenderness as she looked at her daughter. "I remember thinking at the time that God had taken pity on me and sent you to me. You were so weak with a huge scratch on your forehead. And all the time you were calling for your mommy and crying. Crying all the time." Inside Adriana, it was like everything turned upside down. So that woman on the airplane really could have been her mother. She couldn't bear the thought of it. "But how did you manage to keep me from everyone? You and Daddy basically kidnapped me," Adriana questioned, though tears of regret and understanding were already glistening in her eyes. Molly shook her head and shook her husband's hand a little tighter. "It had been found. That's a completely different thing." Maternal jealousy flashed in the woman's eyes. It was necessary to be so unobservant of the child that he alone in the woods confused, and even so much struck. The cuckoo was abroad, not a mother. The father patted his spouse on the shoulder, trying to calm her down, and answered his daughter. "We sold our family gold, all that my grandmother had left from the Tsarist times, and we gave the money to our then chairman as a bribe, so that he could help us to formalize the documents properly." Adriana sat in front of her parents and looked at them with sadness and love at the same time. She understood exactly what had pushed them to such a desperate step. But it didn't make it any easier. "How did you know we adopted you?" "Molly and I didn't tell anyone about it. Everyone hoped it would go to the grave with us." Adriana looked at her parents and realized that they really didn't know anything about her birth mother. "I met a woman on the flight. and the stewardess told her parents about the rich lady, showing them her business card at the same time. Kevin carefully studied the card, then calmly said, "Daughter, if you think it's right, you can meet this woman. We have no right to prevent you. You are already an adult, an independent person. But if you're still disappointed when you find out the truth, know this. Mom and I will always be there for you, and nothing will change for us. It doesn't matter whether we share the same blood or not. We will always be your parents." Adriana hugged her mother and father tightly in gratitude. "Thank you," Betty whispered. "I am the best, my darlings." At her parents' house for a couple more days, Adriana headed back to town. She wanted to meet Betty, and so she asked one of her partners to fill in for her on the flight. So when did Betty find out that Adriana had agreed to meet and take the test? There was no limit to the affluent lady's happiness. A few days later, the test results came back, and to Adriana's great amazement, her new acquaintance was right. Betty was indeed a blood mother. After learning about it, the millionaire immediately invited Adriana to her house, dreamed of showing her the house where the young stewardess had spent the first half of her childhood. When a luxurious car brought Adriana to their estate, the girl could not contain her admiration. Never before in her life, she had not seen such luxury of style that literally squeezed into every piece of furniture and corner of the magnificent green garden, the mistress of the mansion. She was ushered into the living room where Adriana was greeted by her own mother. Betty looked very excited, yet charming. She was wearing a long sleeveless silk jacket and a roomy linen blouse. That, complete with the same pants and a slight blush on her cheeks, made the lady visually younger by about 10 years. Adriana once again marveled at her elusive sense of taste in clothing. "Adriana, I'm so glad you came, honey." The woman shook her hands. "God, I can't believe I finally found you after all these years." Betty hugged her and her daughter, deemed it wrong to reject. It's a heartfelt hug. It wasn't that Adriana was uncomfortable with the display of parental sympathy from her mistress. It was that she still couldn't get used to the idea that it was this woman and not hers. Her mother from the village had given her life. "Let me introduce you to someone." Betty led her daughter into a cozy little room, where in a wide leather armchair sat a presentable-looking man in a business suit. When he saw Adriana, he immediately stood up and extended his hand to greet her. William introduced himself as a businessman and shook his hand gently. "You must not remember me, Adriana." Adriana shook her head and looked questioningly at her mother. "This is your father." "Adriana," Betty said, almost crying with happiness. It was all Adriana could say. She scrutinized William's facial features, but saw no resemblance to herself or her mother. And William himself, when they didn't go into the dining room for tea. He began to behave strangely. He was nervous all the time and smiled broadly. Except it wasn't a genuine smile. If you knew how scared I was. What I experienced when I came to my senses and saw that you are not around. Told her father woke up, and on the hood of the fire is already in full blaze. I got out of the car with great difficulty. My leg was really jammed. I thought maybe you were scared and hid somewhere near the road. But as soon as I got a few meters away from the car, it exploded. The businessman spoke very emotionally, but he looked at his newfound daughter as if he was not happy about her return. Of course, Adriana had no idea that he was not really her biological father. William married Betty when she was already 3 months pregnant, from her first husband, who died in an accident in a neighboring town. Lion was the real birth father's name. Adriana made a deal with very unreliable companions, who eventually faked his death at the construction site of a large apartment complex. He, already being an old friend of the family Chisova, decided to support the young widow without consolation and give the newborn girl his last name. In gratitude, Betty began to invite him to their home more and more often, and later married William. In fact, her stepfather hated Adriana from childhood. He always felt in her a possible competitor, as he wanted to eventually take over the business of his late friend. And what was his amazement when so many years later, this Adriana suddenly reappears like a ghost from the past and tries to mix up all the cards for him. The most unpleasant thing for the businessman was that Betty was serious about bringing her daughter into the business. Betty invited Adriana to the estate more and more often, and Adriana was certainly happy to learn as much as she could about her past and get to know her mother. The young woman did not see her father in any way, as if she felt that he was not her own. Betty said nothing to her daughter, hoping that their misunderstanding would fade with time. "Betty, darling, I'm sorry, but I don't understand why you're so fixated on the idea of Adriana becoming a full owner of the stock. After all, it's been so long, and she's in a very different profession. You can't make a stewardess into a proper businesswoman. I'm sorry to be blunt." Betty looked at her husband with a puzzled expression. "William, our Adriana is a hereditary stranger. She was raised for many years by a completely different set of country people. But that didn't prevent her from graduating with honors from school, from the institute. She's fluent in 2 languages. I'm sure if she just studied a little and got deeper into our business, our genes would take over." William was tearing up. His jowls were going up and down, but there was nothing he could say to his wife. Nevertheless, he had no intention of letting it go, and he began to seriously consider how he could get rid of a long-standing thorn in his side. There was a reason he wanted to do this. The thing was that he had his own trusted people in his wife's company for a long time, with whom he was quietly engaged in fraud and stealing from the firm, laundering money through third-party projects, and transferring it to personal overseas accounts. William planned to eventually completely subjugate the entire board of directors to single-handedly manage all the funds. But to do this, he had to be absolutely sure that Betty would never guess anything. With the advent of Adriana in their lives, the scheme risked cracking, and he intended to do everything he could just to comply, never to touch the underside of the parent company. Calling one of his shady operations assistants into his office one day, William told him it was time to take decisive action. "This little stewardess has already joined our company for an internship, and she doesn't realize what it could do to the whole business." "What are you saying, William? I don't quite follow my boss's train of thought." His assistant, the businessman, turned to him, and a truly diabolical fire registered in his eyes. "I need you to finish for me what I could not do many years ago." Looked carefully at the criminal, and he turned pale, realizing exactly what the director wants from him. Then the businessman continued. "The accident in which I almost crashed with my adopted daughter. I arranged it all by myself. I thought that if we got rid of her now, while she was still young, all the problems would be solved. All these years I hoped she'd disappear into the woods and never be heard from again. And now she shows up out of the blue, and she wants to. And you see, to try and help my mother with the business." The aide, listening to William only gulped with fear. He never thought that he could so easily go to the most terrible crime. What could only be in civilized society to try to kill his own, though adopted child? It was out of line. "I can't let her take away everything I've spent so many years gathering in bits and pieces." The businessman finished his story. "I'm her birth father. That lion with those companions, to eliminate him quietly so that they did not know anything. And now I have to do the same with her daughter." Looked expressively at the young man standing in front of him. "Don't worry about it. I've thought of everything in advance. The day after tomorrow, we set up a meeting in the park in the evening. I want to talk to her without witnesses, to discuss some of her prospects in our firm. And then you know exactly what you need to do. Just don't forget to make it look like a simple robbery. I don't want to be the first to be suspected." The aide, though not happy about such a wet assignment, agreed. What else could he do? After all, he was a man of servitude. Adriana agreed to meet with her stepfather without a second thought, not even knowing what terrible fate he had in store for her. In the late afternoon, when the park was sparsely populated and lit only by the faint glow of evening lanterns, Adriana stopped near the established meeting place with the businessman. The young woman still had no idea that William was not her own father, so she did not feel threatened by him. In any case, their disagreement about her possible work in the company mother. The woman reasoned for herself that they had not seen each other for too many years, so the kinship bond between them was much weaker than that between Adriana and Betty. Adriana paced on the spot for at least half an hour before she decided to dial a number, much to her surprise. The mechanical voice on the other end of the line informed her that the caller was offline. "Strange," she said aloud, and was about to go home when suddenly someone grabbed her from behind and put his hand over her mouth. So she was unable to utter a sound. "Stay quiet, otherwise I'll see you like a sheep." She heard a man's voice behind her back, which turned out to be very vaguely familiar to Adriana. However, when the robber turned the victim to face him, Adriana's horror and shock had no limit. The criminal turned out to be her husband, Charles. He also did not expect to see his former spouse in place of the ordered object. That's why for the first few seconds, he just looked at her in silence, speechless with amazement. Charles didn't even bother to put on a mask. He was so sure that he could get rid of the victim quietly. "Charles, is that really you?" "You're alive," Adriana said with difficulty, looking her ex-husband straight in the eye. "But how? You died in that fire." The investigator told me, Adriana. Charles interrupted her, still holding the woman in his arms. "Believe me, I'm sorry for what happened. But I didn't have any other choice. They would have killed me, killed me anyway." "Who didn't realize anything, Adriana?" "Yeah," Sebastian and his henchmen shook her by the shoulders. "Charles, I heard one of them discussing burying me somewhere in the woods. About a couple weeks after that loan went through. So I decided to run away with the money. I faked my own death in a fire. I had to make it look good, Adriana slowly began to realize the meaning of what the couple had said. "Is that what your plan was?" She said, "You leave me, get away with 20 million, and I'm left to the scum of the earth. So you had it all figured out." Adriana began to fight back as hard as she could, trying to free the target of Charles' grab, inadvertently showering him with accusations. "You set me up. How could you? I loved you so much. I trusted you so much." The ex-husband only held the woman tighter to him and clutched her tightly. Of course, he didn't expect his case. Nothing of the sort. When he had faked his supposed death by fire and disappeared for a while with the bandits' money, the man thought that in this way he had completely deprived the authority and his gang of any leverage against him. But he could not imagine that they would demand his debt from his wife. Just like that, all the money in a short period of time, and left literally with nothing. He couldn't take the business back because it had long been presumed dead. Charles somehow made new fake documents for himself and used them to get a job in the company. And William immediately realized that he had a fake employee in his ranks, but decided not to fire him for the time being, realizing he could exploit his legal troubles against Charles himself. That's why when it came time to get his hands dirty, the businessman chose Adriana's ex-husband, and he was completely unaware of the whole stepfather and stepdaughter thing, and could not even think that the woman he would need to eliminate, and is his ex-wife. Charles now realized more clearly than ever that Adriana was the only witness to all his crimes. Therefore, there was no way he could let her live. "Forgive me, Adriana." He tried to calm her, holding her more tightly to him. But at the same time, he put his free hand over her back. A long knife, glistening in the darkness with its sharp blade. "It will be over now," he said meaningfully, and was about to plunge the blade into the woman's body. But at that second, someone knocked the knife out of his palm in one strong movement, bringing it back 180 degrees. The villain screamed in pain, and Adriana finally managed to release from his stranglehold. She watched in horror as some vagrant in tattered jeans and an old jacket tried to lay a hand on her ex-husband. "Call the police quickly," he shouted to the woman, who noticed that her savior wasn't much older than she was. Adriana, she didn't need to be told twice. So Adriana immediately dialed the short number, and in a few minutes, a police squad came from the nearest post to pick up the scoundrel. Homeless guy gave a statement. He was sleeping on a bench nearby, weather permitting. It's June after all. And then he heard a woman screaming and immediately rushed to help, because he knows that this park is not a peaceful place in the evenings. In the end, the police arrested Charles, and he confessed under interrogation that he had organized the assassination attempt. Adriana's stepfather is equally shocked. Betty also found out about her daughter's loan, and Adriana herself that William is not her own. With a loan. By the way, there was a very successful police operation, thanks to which Sebastian and his gang were finally caught red-handed. The investigator explained to Adriana that she would have to come to a meeting to pay the debt. The deadline given to her 2 weeks ago by the authority had just passed. Although she was very afraid, she trusted the police officers. The woman was wearing a special wiretap, which was used to record the entire conversation between her and Sebastian. After that, the riot police came to the warehouse where the meeting took place and all the scoundrels were arrested. After seeing the story with the money, Adriana went back to the park. She wanted to find and thank the homeless man who had saved her life. However, she never found him. Confused, Adriana went home, and at the moment when she got out of the cab, she noticed a young man with a huge bouquet of scarlet roses near her entrance. I wonder who was so lucky. Adriana thought to herself with a smile as she passed him, and the moment she and the young man were twinned. The stewardess was surprised to realize that she had seen him before. That afternoon smiled radiantly at her homeless man, who was now dressed in a fine, light gray business suit Betty carried, wearing stylish glasses. I apologize for showing up so unexpectedly, but I just couldn't help but see you again. Adriana stood staring at him with all eyes on him. An embarrassed smile slowly appeared on her face. It's you. You're the tramp who rescued me in the park. But how? Why are you here and looking like this? So amazing. The guy jokingly finished for her. Yes, laughed Adriana sincerely. That's exactly what to tell her. The young man explained to her that he actually works as a private psychologist, solving mental problems of successful businessmen and show business stars. And it was a professional need that brought him to the park. Mason was his name. For a long time, he had been writing a PhD thesis on social inequality in modern society. To test some of his theories, he dressed up as a homeless person, hoping to gauge how people from different backgrounds reacted to him. We're better to conduct such experiments than in a huge city park, the psychologist said, after which he handed the young woman a fragrance and a bouquet. Adriana was kidnapped and delighted at the same time. After all, a person is not afraid. To help her in a difficult, deadly minute turned out to be such an interesting and intelligent man. Mason asked her out on a date, and Adriana gladly agreed. The young people went to the opera, and afterward talked for a long time, discussing what they had seen. Gradually, the conversation from the theater moved to other areas of life, and Adriana told the young man that she works as a stewardess, and told him how joyfully her heart sings every time when she rises into the sky on an airliner. Amazing girl, Adriana, Mason said with a smile. To go through so many truly shocking and tragic events, and after that not to break down, not to lose faith in goodness and in something really high. You know, I'd really like to meet you again, if you don't mind. Adriana agreed with a laugh. Of course, she would also be glad to see Mason again. The tactfulness and attentiveness of the young psychologist, as well as his perfect manners, left an indelible mark in her soul. Soon after that, Mason and Adriana began to meet. Young people were literally enchanted by each other, and the feelings between them blossomed exactly beautiful and delicate lily flower. After a few months, they planned to try to move in together in the man's apartment. The couple hoped that after living together for some time, they would finally be sure that the wedding would be the next natural step in the development of their relationship. The only person who wasn't happy about the happiness. Mason and Adriana turned out to be the former fiancé of psychologist Miranda. The girl still hoped to get back her ex, although during their relationship, she and Mason constantly quarreled, and in the end, Mason made the decision to break up with Miranda. But only the former fiancé did not intend to give up without a fight. She hated Adriana with all her heart that dared to steal away from her handsome, intelligent, and most importantly, very wealthy groom. Miranda herself worked as a model, so she understood perfectly well that sooner or later her beauty would start to see her. So she needed to get married as soon as possible. And Mason in this regard was for her just like a perfect candidate. Determined to eliminate her rival, Miranda couldn't think of a better way to do it. Finally risked to follow the couple to the cafe, where they stopped for a snack during the walk. Miranda had gotten the moment and discreetly slipped a few pills of a potent sleeping pill into Adriana's juice glass. This was made possible by an inattentive waiter. Miranda simply walked by, pretending to be a regular customer, and dropped the capsules into her rival's drink. Adriana did not feel well after she drank almost half of the glass. She became abruptly dizzy, and the poor stewardess immediately lost consciousness. Adriana rushed to her Mason. "What's wrong with you?" Calling an ambulance, Mason went with his lover to the hospital, telling the medics that he was her fiancé. Fortunately, Adriana was able to be brought back to life right in the stomach. But on further examination, the doctor noticed something strange. "Tell me honestly, why did you take those pills?" The doctor looked at her sternly. "Were you trying to get rid of the baby?" "No, you could have used your head first. If not for your fiancé, we could have lost both you and the baby." Adriana looked at the doctor with mute astonishment. "I don't understand, doctor. What child do you mean?" "I was only in the cafe with my fiancé." From the look on her face, the doctor realized that the patient had no idea what a surprise your baby's life had given her. "Are you pregnant?" "Adriana, congratulations, 48 weeks." Adriana felt something incredible in her soul, as if all the lights of the world were shining inside her, illuminating the tiny life that she now carried under her heart. Adriana had no doubt that it was Mason's baby, and so she had told him brightly at once. "But this is simply wonderful news." Mason exclaimed joyfully. "Then we'll have to hurry with the wedding." "I don't want my son or daughter to be born out of wedlock." "You are seriously shaking with happiness, Adriana. Honey, you're the best thing in the world. I love you so much. You do?" The young people hugged each other happily. However, the groom was still worried about the question, how the killer was in the potent pills. So he left the hospital for the cafe and demanded to see the security footage of the time he and Adriana had been there. And from there, he went straight to Miranda's house. But by then, she had already repented of what she'd done. She was especially ashamed when she learned that Adriana was expecting a child. "Forgive me," she cried in the hallway when the man came to her and severely reprimanded her for such a cruel and stupid act. "I didn't think it would be like this, baby. He certainly had nothing to do with it." "He had nothing to do with it." "Miranda, do you realize you could have killed them both?" Mason exclaimed angrily. "I told you then. And now I'm telling you again, we will never be together ever again. And stop following me around and hurting my family. You understand me? Otherwise, I'm gonna have to go to the police." Miranda nodded, sobbing. The next day, she packed all her things and left for another city. Her sense of shame was too strong, and it was unpleasant to see the joy of her ex and his happy bride. Adriana, having learned about everything from her fiancé, did not write a statement on Miranda. She forgave the girl after Mason told her that he saw it in the eyes of the model's sincere regret. Now Adriana was much more important to her own child and wedding, rather than jealousy, attempts to get back at someone. Betty knew from her own experience that revenge never ends well. Adriana and Mason got married. The wedding was not the loudest, but it was the most beautiful and memorable, both for all the guests and for the newlyweds. Both Adriana's parents from the village and Betty and Mason's parents were in attendance. Adriana was happy that she now had two moms at once. Betty held no grudge against Adriana's adoptive mother and father. After all, they had sheltered her daughter for many years from the possible harm her stepfather wanted to do to her. After the due date, Adriana gave birth to a wonderful daughter, whom she and her husband named Wendy. Adriana stopped flying for a while, focusing on the family, and Mason continued to work as a psychologist and later successfully defended his scientific work, thereby improving his qualifications and confirming his first-class professional level. Now, Adriana's family has many years ahead of them without rebellious family happiness in the safety and certainty of the future.